Germany surrenders in May of 1945. Within 4 years, the powers occupying it carve the wreckage into 2 separate countries. May, the West gets a republic. October, the East gets its own, answering to Moscow. 4 days after that, on October 11th, a 73-year-old former carpenter stands before the new parliament as East Germany's first president. His name is Wilhelm Pieck. He didn't wait for that moment to start building. In the 2 years before it, he'd already merged his own party with its biggest rival on the left, a voluntary union, the party called it, and chaired the committee that wrote the constitution this country was about to be founded on. Getting elected, it turns out, is the easy part. It's not even the biggest thing he's done. Start with the scale of it, because it's easy to lose. This is a man whose political life runs across 6 decades and 5 different regimes: Wilhelmina, Germany, the Weimar Republic, Nazi rule endured from exile, Stalin's Soviet Union, and finally, a state he helped build from nothing. He rose to senior leadership in 4 separate organizations along the way: a mainstream socialist party, the revolutionary one that split from it, the international body meant to coordinate world communism, and eventually a government of his own, one that, at its founding, governed roughly 18 million people. However you land on what he did with each of those chapters, that's not a footnote in 20th century German history. That's one of its load-bearing names. Take away the myth-making for a second, and you've got a carpenter from Guben, a small Prussian town on what's now the German-Polish border. He finishes a 4-year carpentry apprenticeship, joins the Woodworkers' Union at 18, and joins the mainstream Social Democratic Party the next year, in 1895. For the next 2 decades, he's not a revolutionary. He's a party official. The guy running the local office, first at home, later full-time in Bremen. What breaks him from the mainstream left is the First World War. Most of the Social Democratic Party votes to fund the Kaiser's war. Pieck is one of the minority who refuses, and it costs him. He's arrested, held in a military prison, and briefly has to leave the country. By the time he's back in Germany in 1918, the war is lost, the Kaiser is gone, and the Social Democrats aren't nearly radical enough for him anymore. January of 1919. Berlin is in the middle of what's called the Spartacist Uprising, the first real attempt by German communists to seize power the way the Bolsheviks just had in Russia. It collapses within days. On the night of January 15th, Freikorps soldiers, right-wing paramilitaries the government itself turned loose on the city, hunt down the uprising's 2 most recognizable leaders, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Wilhelm Pieck is arrested right alongside them at the same hotel the same night. Days earlier, the 3 of them had helped found a brand new party together, the Communist Party of Germany, barely 2 weeks old. Luxemburg and Liebknecht don't leave that building alive. Pieck does. For decades, the party's own account treated that as simple luck. Tragedy for 2, survival for 1. But the party itself wasn't fully at ease with that story. 10 years later, in 1929, by at least one historical account, Chairman Ernst Thälmann quietly convened an internal tribunal to look into exactly how Pieck got out of that hotel when his 2 far more famous comrades didn't. Its findings were never made public. Not then, not since. No historian has produced evidence that Pieck did anything to betray Luxemburg or Liebknecht that night. But his own party felt the need to ask the question, and then sealed the answer. It's the first loose thread in a life that has several. Through the 1920s, Pieck climbs the ranks of the new Communist Party. He sits in the Prussian state parliament through most of the decade, and by 1928, he's in the Reichstag and on the Comintern's own executive committee in Moscow. It won't be the only loose thread from this decade. In 1929, amid the fallout of a party corruption scandal, a treasurer in Hamburg had embezzled campaign funds, and the party chairman had tried to cover it up. Pieck loses his post running the party's Berlin-Brandenburg district. The man who takes it from him is Walter Ulbricht. Losing a district post is about to look small. 1933, Hitler takes power, and Pieck, like every senior German communist still breathing, runs. Prague, then Paris, then Moscow, arriving by May. He becomes chairman of the exiled Communist Party the following year, after the Nazis murder his predecessor, and Comintern secretary the year after that. A senior administrator inside the machine meant to coordinate world communism from Soviet soil. The Soviet Union's own encyclopedia, published after his death, describes this period as building a united front against fascism. The archives opened after 1990 describe something else. Between 1936 and 1938, the years of Stalin's Great Terror, the German communists who'd fled to Moscow for safety became targets themselves. By March of 1938, according to historian Reinhard Müller's research into the secret police files, as many as 70% of Communist Party members then living in the Soviet Union had been pulled from their homes into an NKVD cell. Historian Hermann Weber, tracing the party's top 43 leaders, found that more of them died in Soviet custody than were ever killed by the Nazis they'd fled in the first place. Germany's own Federal Resistance Memorial Center, an official government institution, not a fringe source, states it plainly. As Communist Party chairman, Pieck was involved in that persecution. When the machine finished, he was one of a small number of senior party figures still standing. So was Walter Ulbricht. Historians don't treat that as a coincidence. Cooperating with the purification commissions appears to have been part of why either man made it out. 5 years after the terror peaked, in July of 1943, Pieck helps found something called the National Committee for a Free Germany, an organization built out of captured Wehrmacht soldiers and exiled communists, meant to recruit German prisoners of war against Hitler. He's a senior figure in it, not its president, but it's the clearest sign yet of what he's being groomed for. This isn't just survival anymore. Moscow is grooming him for something bigger. 1945. The war ends, and Pieck returns to Germany with the Red Army, landing in the Soviet occupation zone. Over the next 4 years, he's central to building the actual machinery of a future state, twice over. First, the party. By 1946, Pieck has a new project, merging his Communist Party with the larger Social Democratic Party across the Soviet zone. 600,000 members against 680,000. On April 21st, at Berlin's Admiral's Palast, he shakes hands on stage with the Social Democrats Otto Grotewohl in front of more than 1,000 delegates. That handshake becomes the literal logo of the new party, the Socialist Unity Party, or SED, stamped on badges, banners, and official seals for the next 44 years. The party's own telling was unity, the German working class made whole again, healing the split that let Hitler through the door in the first place. The paper trail tells a colder story. Of the delegates in that hall, 47% came from the Communists, 53% from the Social Democrats. But 230 of them had traveled in from the Western occupation zones, including 103 Social Democrats who showed up in direct violation of their own party's position. Archives opened since German reunification, drawn from East German and Soviet documents, describe sustained Soviet pressure and the sidelining of Social Democrats who opposed the merger, especially in Berlin. In the Western occupation zones, where Soviet troops weren't in charge, no equivalent merger ever happened. The Social Democratic Party there stayed independent straight through the Cold War. Second, the state itself. In March of 1948, Pieck is elected chairman of a body called the German People's Council, the group tasked with actually drafting a constitution for what would become East Germany. He holds that post for a year and a half, through committee sessions most people have never heard of, doing the unglamorous work of writing the document a country will be founded on. On October 7th, 1949, that document takes effect. The German Democratic Republic exists. 4 days later, he's sworn in, 73 years old, head of state, the man whose portrait hangs beside Stalin's at rallies. In 1951, he's named a Hero of Labor. In 1953, he receives the Order of Karl Marx, the country's highest honor. Here's what the medals don't tell you. In 1950, 1 year into his presidency, Pieck loses control of his own party. Walter Ulbricht becomes first secretary of the SED, and from that point forward, even straightforward historical summaries of the office put it bluntly. Pieck, as president, never played a major role in the party. Real power sits in the Politburo, under Ulbricht. That gap is visible in real time by June of 1953. Construction workers in East Berlin strike over production quotas. Within a day, it spreads to hundreds of towns, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, calling for the government to resign. Soviet tanks put it down. Pieck is president of the country while this happens. He is not the man deciding how to respond. He gets re-elected anyway, in 1953, and again in 1957, a formality in a system where his own party controlled the ballot. He dies September 7th, 1960, in East Berlin, 84 years old, the only person to ever hold the office of President of East Germany. Within a week, the government doesn't bother replacing him. They abolish the job entirely and hand power to a committee run by Ulbricht. Then the state starts building the myth in earnest, and it doesn't waste time doing it. Some East Germans reportedly called him by an affectionate nickname, Papa Pieck, the elder statesman, the friendly face of a young country. The last leader of East Germany, Egon Krenz, still describes meeting him in person as a boy in 1951, a memory he was writing about publicly as recently as this year. That's the official version, and it's still being repeated today, 75 years later, by people who were there. But the state didn't leave that version to chance. His hometown is renamed Wilhelm Pieck Stadt Guben on what would have been his 85th birthday in 1961. A large concrete monument goes up there in 1976 for his 100th. Pieck, alongside Ernst Thälmann and other senior party figures, in the socialist realist style the regime favored for its saints. Berlin renames one of its major streets after him. Then, in the autumn of 1989, that same concrete monument in Guben becomes a gathering point for the protesters trying to bring the whole system down. Once East Germany actually falls, the argument over what to do with Wilhelm Pieck's name starts almost immediately, and it hasn't really stopped since. In Berlin, officials voted to strip his name from Wilhelm Pieck Straße and restore its older name, Torstrasse. When the district surveyed residents first, the result wasn't what you might expect. 170 of them wanted to keep his name on the street. 26 wanted it gone. Another 183 signed a petition against the change. The district government renamed the street anyway in July of 1994. Gubin's monument is still standing. City officials chose not to tear it down, and in 2023, they installed a new plaque next to it, one that actually explains who Pieck was, purges included, instead of just his name and dates. And as recently as December of 2025, Germany's Federal Commissioner for the Victims of the SED Dictatorship, Evelyn Zupke, went public, calling for the remaining streets still named after Pieck to be renamed too. At least one is still standing, in a town called Velten, north of Berlin. This January marked 150 years since his birth, and German press coverage split along predictable lines. Critical reassessment in the mainstream papers, nostalgic tribute in the outlets still loyal to the old party. 35 years after reunification, Germany still hasn't fully settled what to do with this man's name. He built a state that stopped needing his job within a week of his death. He built a party that decided, starting the year after he took office, exactly how much power he'd get to use. Even his own name isn't his to control. Last December, Germany's own commissioner for the victims of the dictatorship he helped build asked for what's left of it to come down. Other people decided things for Wilhelm Pieck his entire life, his party, the Kremlin, history. 35 years after the country he built stopped existing, that still hasn't changed.